Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to newsCOUP at Public Herald, where we overthrow the status quo. This is our first broadcast live, and I am your host, Joshua PRIBANIC, co-founder of Public Herald. I am joined by my co-founder, Melissa TROUTMAN, and special guest, Sierra Shamer tonight. And then we have the wizard behind this broadcast, which is Andrew Geller. He's our production engineer. You can't see him, but he's definitely there tweaking and doing stuff. So I do want to start by saying that I would like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional lands of the Monongahela, the Iroquois, the Lenape, and the Shawnee in what's otherwise known as Pittsburgh right now. We don't know all the other traditional lands that might have been here due to the colonizers and what happened. And I would like to acknowledge that I am part of a legacy of colonization in this country, built on stolen land and built by the enslavement of people of color. With that, I hand it to you, Melissa.
Oh, thank you, Josh. Tonight, everybody, we're going to dig into some really big news that was dropped last week by Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro. Here in Pennsylvania, where Public Herald has been investigating the cover-up of water contamination since 2011. It's no coincidence that our focus, the focus of our investigations here at Public Herald over the past nearly a decade, are also the subject of Shapiro's big news. In the past 3 weeks, the Attorney General has charged 2 fracking companies, Range Resources and Cabot Oil and Gas, for environmental crimes related to drinking water contamination and other harms. But even though the families who suffered the most from these crimes had to wait a decade for these particular charges from a state official, the AG's charges are still a big deal, even though they took so long, for a couple reasons that we'll talk about later. But the even bigger news from the Attorney General's office came last week when, during a live webcast, he straight up scolded the Department of Environmental Protection, which is the state agency in charge of policing the oil and gas industry. And he charged them with things like indifference. He released a grand jury report that gave in great detail the evidence behind DEP's indifference to citizens, their bowing to industry pressure, and the grand jury found essentially the same things that Public Herald found in our own investigation released in 2017. The grand jury found that DEP failed to regulate, failed to test for water contamination, failed to inspect problems when citizens called, failed to notify people when the groundwater was polluted and they could be drinking poison, failure to issue violations, and the failure to listen. So, Josh, we've been waiting for an announcement like this for a while. Ever since we met with the AG's investigators back in 2017. Can you real quick give a little bit of the background about the relationship that we had back then?
Yeah, so I just want to say to the viewers, I know we have people from other states that are coming into this, and if you have questions or thoughts that you want to share, just please go into our live chat and drop us a comment on YouTube. I know that the YouTube one's being monitored, maybe the other social media. But the way that all this started was, at least on our end, was, as Melissa said, we dropped this report in 2017. It did 2 things. It showed the data from the state, which was totally hidden about these complaints, was perfectly aligned with widespread and systemic impact across the state. The complete opposite of what the EPA federal study was trying to say at that time. The second piece of data was that when you went into those records, and I mean, talk about a difficult task. Melissa and I started in 2011 to try and look at these records. We didn't get the first one till 2013. Okay, from 2013 until 2017, we had people from all different walks of life going into DEP's office to scan these records, because that's how long it took us to get them out and make them fair. We analyzed them. We analyzed 1,000 of them, and Sierra's with us tonight. She did a lot of this work for us. We analyzed those records, and we discovered through that analysis that this is not an anecdotal problem at DEP. Okay, there is official misconduct in every single region: the Southwest region, the West region, the Northeast region. Everybody's got their own little flavor of how they're cooking the books, violating Section 3218, Title 58 of Pennsylvania's law. And we named every single DEP individual in that investigation and backed it up with specific cases from sources that we have across shale gas counties. Now, we then met with Attorney General Josh Shapiro's office in May 2017. And that happened because there was an outcry after we published our report. There were people flooding the Attorney General's office with phone calls about DEP and the crimes they committed and the industry and the environmental crimes they committed. And let's just be clear. When it comes to the DEP crimes, they're a little more difficult to figure out. The industry crimes, you can walk into the file room blindfolded, throw a dart, and you're going to hit an environmental crime from the industry. They're literally everywhere. So we then, based on all these people pressuring the AG, were able to have this meeting with them, with Melissa, Sierra, myself, Dr. John Stoltz, and then other impacted residents, people who helped set this up, and Carol French, who's in our film Triple Divide. You know, all different kinds of people drove to the AG's office to share that story in May 2017. And that's where we met with the investigators that you hear Shapiro thanking at the beginning of his video. And we handed to them these hard records of evidence. And we said, here you go. Now get out there and see what happens. And the first thing I remember, the first reaction to them was like, you know, holy shit, this is way too much information. What are we supposed to do with all this? They didn't. The good thing was they didn't say it isn't real. They seemed to think that was possible. And that was really hopeful, I think, for all of us. But what they did do was they were like, could you guys like narrow this down to like the smoking guns of these investigations? So from that meeting, we then narrowed it down to the smoking guns. We started publishing them, and then things started to get weird at the AG. It was like, you know, so-and-so agent was leaving for Congress. So-and-so agent was like, you know, resigning. And we were like, okay, well, we're not going to stay quiet about this anymore. So we published a report in October 2017 saying that the AG was out there. They were investigating these crimes, and be sure to keep calling them. So again, in October, all of a sudden, flood of phone calls at the AG's office. I know this because we RTK'd their phone records, and they gave us all this data. So that then we then waited, mostly impatiently. I think me definitely I waited patiently for an answer about what the AG was going to do with all of this. And then, as you guys saw, this big announcement came with DEP, and that's what we're going to hit on today. A lot of it we're going to talk a lot about what's not in that announcement versus kind of what everybody heard. So all right, Andrew, let's take a minute and let's try and watch what the AG said. And Andrew, if you want to roll that video, everybody wants to take a couple minutes. I know you've probably seen this. Give it another look.
The grand jurors heard from DEP employees who testified that the oil and gas industry wanted to do the right thing, and the threat of civil penalties are sufficient to achieve compliance with the law. They are simply not. The grand jurors heard from a homeowner who personally observed a spill occurring in the creek near his property. He saw the creek change colors. He took a video. He called DEP and described what was happening in real time. And Dennis, here's the answer that he got from DEP. A threat to be prosecuted for filing a false report. That was the response of government. That answer is a violation of the public trust, and it's an outrageous, bureaucratic disregard for the rights of the people of Pennsylvania. That is not how this is supposed to work. Government is here to set and enforce the rules to protect the public. DEP was actually given this report months ago, and they had the opportunity to respond. And in the report that has been shared with you, you'll be able to read their full, unedited response. They had the opportunity to educate the public. They had the opportunity to offer their view about how we can improve our environmental laws. Instead, what did DEP do? They spewed industry talking points at the public rather than listening to the evidence and explaining what went wrong. They are more interested in fighting than serving the public. They even went so far, get this, they even went so far as to oppose policy reforms recommended by these grand jurors. Their response from DEP is filled with inaccurate assumptions, industry assertions, and most disappointingly, just straight out falsehoods. Let me mention two of them to back up the point I just made. DEP, in their response, you'll read, said that they were never invited to fully present their case to the grand jury. In reality, they were offered unprecedented and unfettered access. Who did come? Well, Secretary Levine came for the Department of Health. She offered testimony, she answered questions, and she explained their new study. DEP? Well, they didn't apparently have time for the people that they are supposed to serve. DEP said testimony, the other thing is DEP said the testimony relied on hearsay and that the health impacts were not significant. That's the words not of the fracking companies, but DEP, the people who are supposed to be working for you. Respectfully, that attitude that is demonstrated in DEP's response, that is part of the problem that we are facing here in Pennsylvania. Think of that mom who's woken up in the middle of the night to comfort a bleeding child. Not significant. That's what her regulators said to her. Look, we need to admit the government failed. And we need to admit, and then we need to work together to make it better. We need to be big enough to fix the mistakes, not gaslight the public. DEP, let me be clear, they need to clean up their act.
Can you speak to how close during the course of this investigation, how close the investigation came to filing charges against any public officials, be they DEP inspectors?
I can't comment on that at this time. The only thing I can comment on at this time is what is contained within the four corners of the report. But what is clear is that the relationship is too cozy. It's clear from DEP's own response that they were just simply spewing back a lot of talking points from the industry. And I think that relationship needs to be closely examined.
Okay, everyone, we're back. We just heard Josh Shapiro's official scolding of the DEP. And I mean, I have to say it was pretty good. He did. This is extraordinary. We have an official who, is in one of the leading positions to hold DEP accountable, like the governor. We have this official coming out and saying that there were systemic problems, like we talked about before. There was clearly official misconduct, like we talked about before. The agency needs to clean up their act. I mean, that's pretty powerful. And again, this revolving door situation, the fact that the relationship is too cozy. But we did hear also something about they can't comment about charges against DEP at this time. So that for us is hopeful. Okay, so I mean, we're riding that on the positive side, hoping that Scott Perry will end up in handcuffs for what he's done to families across this state very soon, because he deserves that for the lies that he's told again and again since 2010 about this industry. Things that for me that are like that just like stand out the most, that's missing from that kind of explanation, that are really conflicting to hear from Shapiro, is this isn't about stopping fracking, but this is about correcting a narrative, right? Well, if you correct the narrative, and the narrative is that fracking is doing all this harm to people and nobody's stopping it and it's running rampant across the state, then why isn't this conversation about stopping fracking? How is he going to solve the crimes, the health problems, and everything else if he doesn't stop fracking or if he doesn't have a moratorium? I mean, I was shocked to find out that in these 8 recommendations from the grand jury, nobody's talking about a moratorium on fracking or a ban on fracking, which is so obscene. After all of this stuff they've heard, somehow the conversation you would think we'd be having as journalists right now is, what's the future going to look like with a ban on fracking now that the grand jury just said the industry's out of control and the state's out of control? But that's not even in any headline at all. It's outrageous. So we heard these things, and that was the one thing that stood out to me big time. The other thing that stands out is that you have this impression that if the DEP was operating by the law, if they were holding the companies accountable, that somehow all of these problems would be solved. But that's also completely false. If they drill another well, there will be more water contamination. If they drill another well, there will be more radioactive waste brought out of the ground, contaminating something underground or contaminating our rivers in the radioactive leachate report that we saw. All of these impacts will continue to happen. Children will continue to get sick. Families will continue to be forced to live on properties they shouldn't be forced to live on with an industry like this. And moving the wells away 2,500 feet, as Melissa knows with the circumstances she's under, is not going to solve those problems. So if DEP is operating at 100% efficiency, it does not stop that stuff. It's going to continue and continue and continue. All that will happen is that the industry will have higher penalties and you'll see higher rates of violations at wells. But remember, there is no law in this state that says you as an industry are not allowed to contaminate X percentage of a municipality or X percentage of a county. You can't contaminate their water and continue to operate. There's no law that says that they can't contaminate 50, 60% of a water supply. So they will continue to receive violations under a DEP who works. They will continue to get fines and penalties under a DEP that works. They may even continue to have more environmental crimes. So we're at, what, 12,000 wells right now with the expectation of 100,000 wells? Just imagine where that takes us into the future, Melissa.
Well, you mentioned fines, and one of the when the AG came out with his charges against or his announcement about Range Resources a couple weeks ago, where Range pled no contest to the charges brought by the Attorney General, their punishment was a fine, and it was the fine was so small in the general scheme of things. I mean, this is a company that makes billions of dollars a year. That former DEP Secretary John Quigley called it a slap on the wrist. So this is a company that a decade ago poisoned people's water, denied it, and meanwhile, these families have suffered untold. I mean, we can't even know the suffering that they underwent. And when the AG comes out with his charges against Range Resources, they're fined. What didn't happen, and what I haven't heard, is that Range Resources isn't allowed to drill in Pennsylvania again. That Range Resources, because they are a bad actor, are not allowed to get new permits. Nobody said that. So is this company allowed to get a slap on the wrist from the Attorney General and continue drilling in Pennsylvania? Is that a thing? I think that it should be noted that after over 280 hours of testimony, the grand jury came out with this report. And like Josh said, it does not say anything about stopping the harm. It doesn't say anything about that. It just seems kind of twisted to me that you would write a 240 some page report, that anyone would write that, and that the Attorney General would release this report that goes into great detail all of the horrors that have occurred, and still say, essentially by saying this is not about fracking, what this is implying is that even though we have all this evidence, we're still going to move forward with this. Permits will still be issued, fracking will still happen, and harm will continue. Like you said, Josh, harm will continue. I think it's kind of twisted. I don't.
It sounds twisted.
It doesn't make me feel any better, honestly. It doesn't. It makes me feel a little worse because the evidence is all there, and they're still saying it's just keep going, just continue.
The dangers that we'll face with an industry that's operating under the current ability to impact families and impact the environment that's happening right now in the state of Pennsylvania, the dangers that they will face will be extreme. As Dr. Tony Ingraffia told us when we brought him in for this report as an expert, that there will be places in Pennsylvania that will be unlivable because of fracking. Imagine that. Unlivable, coming from one of the foremost experts in the industry, if all of this stuff continues. So under those circumstances, this kind of unlivable story in the grand jury report, why would Josh Shapiro not make this about whether or not this industry should continue to operate? And specifically, whether or not the DEP should continue to operate. I mean, if anything, if we can shut somebody down, DEP needs to have their doors closed immediately. They should not be rubber stamping permits in the middle of the COVID crisis with inspectors who can't go out and actually inspect these wells. As Melissa found out recently up on her land when she had a pollution problem up there, and the DEP refused to come out until we sent them drone footage of the pollution, and then all of a sudden it was verifiable enough for them to act. What you're creating is what we published in our first story about the complaint investigations. You have a family like the Pepper family. You have water being splashed on their face, the mother experiencing burning on her face, not being able to give kids the water, losing their water supply in the middle of one of the coldest winters in the state, having to go then find water and bring it back to their house. When they call the state to get help, the state had laws available to them to make the industry give them water. The state lied to them. They lied to them and told them that the law didn't have to do that and that the industry didn't have to provide them with water, and forced this family to go out and continue to pay for water, continue to go try and find it, and put them through an unbelievable amount of stress. At the same time, they test the water, find contaminants in the water, and then blame it on the well being too low to do proper testing, or a lab contaminant like acetone. They blame it on acetone being a lab contaminant, okay? And then they don't come back out and do another test. Okay, that's one complaint story. We went out there, had independent testing done. We were going to fight this case in the court until it just became too much for a family to handle. When we did that test, when we isolated acetone, acetone was found in that water supply. It was not a lab contaminant. It was in their water. Guess what? Acetone is part of the fracking chemical solution. It's part of the surfactants. And this story where DEP is creating this culture of poisoning people and allowing the industry to walk away from it, to not even have to deal with the smallest part of the law that they have to follow, which is providing the family with water until the investigation is concluded. That will play out thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times in Pennsylvania. Right now, you're looking at over 5,000 drinking water complaint investigations that have happened here. If the industry keeps building out at the levels that 30, 40,000 wells, you can just keep doubling those numbers because the complaints have not slowed down. Shapiro discussed this idea that somehow under Governor Tom Wolf, the industry has improved, that they've become better actors and things have gotten better. Well, I don't know where Shapiro found that data. But when we went through this complaint data that we extracted out of the office and put into a chart and mapped and everything else, what we found that while Governor Wolf took office in 2015, the complaints actually doubled and increased and got worse than any other time in history. So all of the impacts were far greater under Governor Tom Wolf. And the same thing is true for the violations. The only reason that you don't see violations at the same level of, for instance, 2013 and 14 is partly due to the reduced volume in drilling, but mostly due to the fact that the DEP is using a discretionary choice to not issue the violation because they're saying the industry cleaned it up within 24 hours, which is not true in most cases. Okay, so there is ways that these numbers are being manipulated. Absolutely, Melissa.
Real quick, Josh, I see that we're getting some really great questions that are coming in, and we're going to get to those in just a second. I do want to point out right before we bring on Sierra Shamer, from the grand jury report, the findings state, we believe that many DEP employees were doing the best job possible with the limited resources they had. We also believe there were others who appeared to show undue deference to the fracking industry and undue indifference to citizens with serious complaints about appalling effects they were suffering. So if you work at the DEP and you're watching tonight, it's always been our position to we have relationships with certain people at DEP that gave us information that became whistleblowers for us. So there are really good people who work within the department. It's the leadership level that's created a culture of deferring to industry that we're really talking about here. So a couple questions. I see one from Josh Eisenfeld and one from Jan Milburn. And I just want to give a shout out to Vera. Hey, Vera. Yeah, Vera says over 12 years of contamination and impacts, and they're still allowed to drill. That's what we're talking about. And that is something that we need to figure out how to change. And the public, not we, the Public Herald, need to figure out how to change in the future. Before we get to your questions, though, I want to bring on our lead researcher and an author on Public Herald's 2017 report about DEP misconduct to talk about some of those specific complaints and the horrific things that people have been suffering here in Pennsylvania. Sierra, welcome, and it's great to see you again.
Hi, thanks for having me back. It's been a while. Yeah, like you and Josh had said, 3 years ago, we concluded our investigation for, at least two and a half years. Like you, I was unsure what the impact of our work would be. And after this report came out, my initial feeling was it's just really, really great to have the widespread misconduct of DEP brought to light, and then also to have each element of their specific failures that you discussed earlier, the failure to test, regulate, notify the public, etc., to be very clearly outlined in that report. And I also hope that the report in some way validates everyone who has been harmed by the natural gas industry as they struggled to have their voices heard, as they were silenced by the companies through gag orders, and as they were denied assistance and help from the state. So overall, it's an exciting development, and I really do hope that we will see some follow-up from the Attorney General, and we will see DEP officials who allowed this to happen be held accountable in some way moving forward.
Sierra, I want to dig into some of the complaints that were most impactful to you during your research back in our investigation. Would you mind sharing? Remind me how many complaints did you read? Just you during that whole time?
So I probably read, of our 4,100 drinking water complaints, I read over 1,000 of them. And so that involves, looking at the document, looking at the initial complaint by the resident where they call in and explain to the DEP what happened, like, oh, my water tastes salty, or my water is, on fire, or my water is burning my skin or my face, to the DEP going out and testing what those test results look like, and then ultimately finding what the DEP's conclusion was on that investigation, their final determination. So between 2004 and 2016, again, we had over 4,000, and I read 1,000 of them. And the DEP determined that 93% of those complaints were not related to industry activity at all. And so we were like, how is this possible? What kind of sense does this make? And that's why we did that deep dive into them. And so we found essentially 178 cases of the 1,000 that I reviewed where we felt that there was enough evidence to conclude that DEP officials were negligent, that they broke rules and regulations, and in other cases, broke the law. So I can talk about some of those cases.
Yeah, why don't you share one or two that really stuck with you?
Sure. So I think, as we talked about, or as you talked about earlier, in the grand jury report, they noted that the DEP basically just does what the industry wants. They're very hesitant to challenge the industry. And this was one of the most disappointing things to see for me as I read the report. And there are instances where the DEP goes and they test and they see as clear as day that there is contamination and that person's water supply is undrinkable. But instead of doing something about it, instead of determining that it was impacted, they take a different course of action. So in one case, there was a resident in Washington County. They reported poor water quality to the DEP. Both DEP and the nearby company, Dominion, they go out and test the water. The water is found to be contaminated. And then instead of making a determination, ordering that company to replace the water immediately, DEP official instead tries to convince the resident to agree to a settlement with Dominion, the company, but they refused. And so DEP tried a number of times. They refused to agree to this settlement. So only at that time did DEP issue a restore and replace order for that water supply. In other cases, as we know very well, DEP would ignore the obvious contamination, choose particular contaminants and say, oh, that's related to background conditions. Oil and gas had nothing to do with it. So we have another case here, a resident reported bubbling in the water supply. The nearby gas company, Chesapeake, was already in the process of installing ventilation at his home to remedy the problem. So they were already acknowledging that it's very likely that their activity had impacted that water. The DEP official tests the water. They find high levels of methane and metals. In addition, DEP was already conducting an investigation in that area about methane in multiple other wells. So they were aware that this was an issue. So despite all of this evidence, DEP concludes that the methane is a background condition and that nearby fracking is not the cause. However, they never provided an explanation for the high levels of metals, including arsenic, iron, and aluminum. They just ignored that completely. And so what are the impacts of this? The impacts are that people maybe are drinking their water because they think it's okay, or they continue to have to purchase water. In some cases, there's another case where a woman had called in. She had experienced loss of hair, shortness of breath, a high heart rate, and high blood pressure. And when she looked this up, she figured out that it was probably barium exposure or barium poisoning. When she called DEP, they tested her well and they found levels of barium over 2 times the acceptable levels. But despite never having experienced these issues before, in the past, DEP tells her that there's historical issues with that water in the area and that it's background conditions. It has nothing to do with fracking. And these are the kind of very frustrating things where why does DEP not want to hold the industry accountable when there's clear evidence that they're impacting people's drinking water?
All right. We have a few more questions coming in that I want to get to, looking at the time here. Really quick, though, first, Josh, do you have any complaints that really, of those 1,000 that we looked through, that are really still sitting with you? I know you already shared the pepper story, but have any kept you up at night over these last few years?
Well, there's the ones that, where people have died and we don't know why they died, that really bother me. And that this happened, of course, in southwestern Pennsylvania, and it has happened in north central Pennsylvania, and the ones in north central Pennsylvania where I went to these families' homes, and I visited those homes for years, and then to see them pass away is really hard to keep coming back to. But in one instance, the culture is just so complex on these cases. You have a person who owns the property and who has leased the well pad. That person's water is contaminated. In this one instance, they're negotiating a settlement with Shell, the company Shell, and DEP is not involved. DEP called to try and open a complaint investigation. The person didn't want them involved, but the DEP knew a pollution settlement was being negotiated. Now, DEP has no policy or anything to notify the surrounding neighbors that this is happening. Okay? So what happens? The surrounding neighbors start calling with water contamination. They start having all of these things show up in their water supply. What's DEP do? They test for a limited number of gases, a limited number of metals. They don't test for all the VOCs and chemicals associated with it. And they do not test for radioactivity, which is in every single sample of wastewater or waste that we've ever seen from the industry that came out of the ground. So they then find contaminants in those neighbors' property downhill from this person who's making the settlement at the top. Do they issue a positive determination letter so that it goes on the public list and that person's water supply is restored or replaced? No. Those people's water supplies are still contaminated, still not restored to this day. How could that have happened? Well, the DEP waited for 16 months to finish their investigation until one of their tests found samples of these chemicals just below MCL, just below the maximum contaminant. And keep in mind, some of these things were never there, okay? Arsenic was never there. All of a sudden it's there. And then it comes below the MCL, and then they say, the industry didn't impact your water supply. Have a nice day. Enjoy the rest of your life. We're sorry that you're sick, and the doctors told you we don't understand why you're sick, and you should move out of your home and you should go somewhere else. And sorry that your father has passed away from brain cancer very recently. And, good luck out there. That's the kind of thing that the DEP is doing. And that's the kind of story that just drives me out of my mind. The only other one I want to mention is the one in Triple Divide. In Triple Divide, we talk about the RW04 well. Okay. That well is in the EPA's national study. In that national study, it says that it was inconclusive if that water supply was contaminated. No. That person waited 5 years, and then they made a settlement with Chesapeake Energy that their water supply is contaminated. Right when the EPA report came out, they gave half the money to the church. And I know this. I went to the guy's house every year and talked to him. Half the money to the church, half the money they used to go buy another home, and then they sold somebody their home with this contaminated water. Both of those cases I just mentioned, neither of them are on the DEP's list of publicly contaminated water supplies by the industry. That list is so far-fetched from reality. No newspaper should be citing it without citing these specific examples. It should be immediately retracted and corrected in every single publication across the state and across the country. It is totally false. That first story where the guy was negotiating the settlement at the top of the hill, that was the stock 144 well. His water was contaminated. The person down at the bottom of the hill, their water was contaminated. RW04, their water was contaminated. Are any of them on that list? Absolutely not. And there are hundreds of these across the state.
So for anyone who hasn't seen the complaints themselves, they are very powerful. And for anyone in the media, particularly, like Josh said, the number of wells that DEP says on its website have been contaminated by oil and gas is highly inaccurate. And so part of the reasons we did this investigation and pulled all of these complaints out of the shelves at DEP offices is to make them public. So all of these complaints that we gathered, over 7,000 of them, are now public online, and you can see them at publicfiles.org. And when you go to that website, you will see a map. You will be able, you can click on individual municipalities, and it will bring up all the complaints that you can read. You can read right down through the complaints for that municipality from that map. So I want to get to a couple questions, Josh. Is that okay if we do that now?
Yeah, sure. We should hit them up. There's a couple good ones coming in from, I see Ray Kemble's on, and Jan Milburn and Josh Eisenfeld. We should definitely hit those.
Okay, so I see that. Let's see. So Josh Eisenfeld. By the way, Josh, I saw your op-ed in the Trib. Awesome. Props to you. Thank you for writing that in. He said, "Let's talk realistic action. A lot of us here are on the same page. This is an atrocity. But how do we move forward? What are you hearing as some good solutions that will be widely accepted?" Before we answer, I just want to be clear that as journalists, as investigative filmmakers, we do draw a line in the sand where we see injustice repeated time and time again, and we know that it's a systemic problem. It's not just a blip on the radar that could, we draw a line in the sand and we say this needs to stop. So like the Guardian has a Keep It in the Ground campaign, Public Herald is a Do No Harm. Okay. So with that said, Josh, and I'm not sure if Sierra is still with us, but what do we do about this moving forward? What do you guys think?
The public, you guys should be so thrilled right now. There are so many things that, of course, we said that are problematic with this, but there is a piece of gold here, a huge piece of gold. And it is that in the new film, Invisible Hand. Okay, with Invisible Hand, we had people coming to us from all over the place after watching Triple Divide saying what Josh is saying. How do we move forward? What are we supposed to do? So we looked at people who were moving forward with zoning. Where did they go? They failed. Like pretty much every time. They tried to rezone their land for new oil and gas infrastructure and push it aside. And guess what? It doesn't work. Okay, the industry will destroy you in a zoning board hearing. And if they don't, they'll replace your elected officials and get a new zoning board put together, and they will literally vote down your comprehensive plan in one night that you worked on for 5 years. It is astonishing. So we abandoned that story, which we tried to cover for the film because it didn't go anywhere. We did find Grand Township, and we found this rights of nature case, right? We found this community rights case. And whether or not you believe in community rights or whether or not you believe in rights of nature, in Pennsylvania, your most strongest ally under the law is home rule. Get rid of the zoning, get rid of the ordinance efforts, move and shift into home rule. You deal with DEP and you deal with this agency and you deal with the governor forcing this stuff on you by passing home rule laws that dictate how you will protect your community. Now, why is this a huge piece of gold for you? Because in Grant Township's case, in Invisible Hand, what they had to prove in court to stop DEP was that they were incapable of performing their duties as an agency. They were using Public Herald stories about this, other things about this, right? You just have been given a grand jury report that says exactly that. So if you pass home rule and the DEP wants to take you to court, guess what? You're dropping the grand jury report on their face, and what the hell are they going to do about that? I mean, you're talking about this amazing 2-year investigation from the AG. You have just been granted the opportunity to ban fracking on the local level, ban T-norm in landfills on the local level, ban radioactive waste going into your rivers on the local level. You can ban every single part of this industry that you want on the local level because of this grand jury report and because of what home rule law allows you to do and because of how scared DEP was of Grant Township in the film Invisible Hand. They were freaked out that they were going to have to argue that they were doing their job correctly in court, and they ran away like cowards.
They did so by revoking the injection well permit that they issue for Grant Township. It's the only time we've ever seen DEP revoke a permit was in Grant Township. And when DEP announced that revocation in the letter that they sent to the company, they explicitly said that the reason they're revoking the permit is because it conflicted with the local law. So Josh is right. This is a really promising movement, and like he said, if you don't believe in community rights or rights of nature as something that can be widely accepted, think about this. Yeah. What if Grant Township was not the only township doing this? What if there were 50 townships across Pennsylvania who were all passing local laws banning this? How can I mean, that is the epitome of building power from the ground up. With enough of that happening, the people at the top are going to have to follow suit. They're just going to have to. All right, I want to go on to another question. Jan. Hi, Jan. It's been such a long time. Can you comment on what you think will happen next with this? Any further action regarding the industry? Will it influence judges, local officials, etc., in our opinion?
Well, I mean, you just heard what I said about home rule. Where you drop this in front of a judge, they don't get to walk away from a grand jury's decision about DEP being incapable of functioning, and that's why you as a community need to protect yourself. So absolutely going to influence judges. Local officials, same thing. I mean, why can't you hold them accountable to make this kind of decision to protect your community? Because right now, you are at risk, okay? With the DEP agency and the way they operate, you are at risk every single day. And one of the ways you're at risk is if you have a sewage plant, and that sewage plant is accepting leachate from a local landfill who's taking on the fracking waste, because that waste is filled with radioactivity, as we reported in 2019, and it is getting into the leachate, is going into your sewage plant and into your waterway. Now, Jan or somebody else might say, well, this isn't about that. Well, guess what? It's going to be about that, because one of the stories coming out at Public Herald very soon, we have a series of 6 investigations coming out. One of them deals with how the AG's office has opened up an environmental crimes unit on this T-norm situation, on this radioactive leachate story. That is happening, and we're pretty excited to publish about it. So stay tuned on that. So you're going to see some action on that level, and I really, really hope that the new grand jury gets to talk about T-norm and talk about radioactivity, Melissa, because that was one glaring piece of information not said, not talked about in all these 3 videos, which has been something that DEP has been able to dodge for so long now, and I'm hoping that that'll change.
Yeah, you're right. The radioactivity is huge. That issue is huge because no one likes to even hear the word radioactivity, and let alone find out that it's in the trucks that are driving past our homes and our schools and our businesses. The DEP has been complicit in the cover-up of just how radioactive this industry is. That is also a fact. We've reported a little bit on that in Public Herald. I've worked on that a little bit over at Earthworks as well. And it is something, like Josh said, that will be coming out more in our future reports at Public Herald. But to kind of close up what Jan asked, will this influence our local elected officials, our judges? If we make it influence them, it absolutely can. I think that it's important. Like Josh said, this is a gold mine, and it's up to us to pick it up and use it. So Adrian, hi Adrian. Adrian asks, has there been any research yet into any connections between DEP officials and corporations, lobbyists, or if these DEP positions were filled politically, with low competence personnel? Yeah. And Josh and Sierra, I do want you guys to hit that, but I want to cite page 49 of the grand jury report when they're talking about how disturbing the reports about DEP were in that testimony. The grand jury says, as our investigation progressed, we learned of a joke circulated in Harrisburg that there was an oil and gas industry lobbyist for every member of the General Assembly. We assume that is hyperbole, but the concern would explain a lot of what we saw and what we heard from DEP employees themselves at both high and low levels. So it's right there in the grand jury report. The industry's influence both within the agency and in our political system is a joke. It's literally a joke. So, Sierra, do you have anything about this that you've heard or know?
Sure, yeah, and I think that's a definite concern. So when I look at the agency's report and the recommendations, my first thought is a lot of those recommendations are going to have to be changes that are made in how DEP operates, and the people that have to make those decisions, to my knowledge, are legislators, our state legislators. They're going to also have to be the ones who provide additional funding for training that DEP is going to need if they're going to actually be able to regulate an industry which the state has decided to keep allowing to operate. So unfortunately, if our legislators do not make those changes, if there's not pressure on them to make those changes, I fear that they will not happen. At this stage, they're just recommendations. And so that is one concern that I have. And I was very glad to see the revolving door issue mentioned in the report, because we talk about that a lot. We touched on it a little bit in our investigation, but we did primarily focus on the complaints. So I was really glad to see that in there. And if it's possible that they can limit the amount of time that passes before a DEP or government official works for the industry, that would be great. So that's something that I would hope to see. But with our state legislature now, I fear that it may not happen as quickly as we'd like.
Well, yeah, absolutely, Sarah. And the damage has been done. I mean, look at the revolving door that's already happened. Look at Michael Crancer. Look at these water specialists who were water specialists handling water contamination cases that involve a really complex understanding of hydrogeology in this area. Okay. They were 24 years old, fresh out of an environmental science major. Okay. I mean, I don't know what kind of wizards that they were able to make conclusions about, water contamination in Southwest Pennsylvania that's filled with all this background industry. But these were the folks who were doing these investigations with Vincent Yanko, okay, at the DEP, handing it off to Scott Perry and then saying, guess what? There's 500, 600 complaints in Washington and Greene County, and we only think one complaint or maybe two complaints are valid. What the hell are they talking about? Over in Bradford County, there might have been 500 complaints up there with a whole bunch of misconduct happening as well, with also people in the revolving door left and right. But at least over there, they had like 60 positive determination letters. So, yes, who was working in these places was a huge deal. That guy I mentioned who was 24 worked there for a year and a half, and then he went straight to Chevron in 2011. He's been there ever since as their regulatory affairs official. And Melissa, you remember when we first went to do a file review, remember the guy that you met who was fresh out of the bar?
Yes, he was a bar. He was in charge of the waste. Yes, he was in charge of handling all of the waste.
Unqualified. Totally unqualified.
And he had no environmental background or waste background. And I asked him what he did before joining DEP, and he said that he was a bartender. I've been a bartender. I love bartenders, but you should not be in charge of radioactive waste.
Well, I'll add as well. I'll add as well that one of the more amusing complaints that I read involved a DEP inspector who suspected that the waste material was being dumped over the side of a well pad, and basically the basin had filled up and then it was overflowing. And he was peering behind a bush watching this happen. And then when the well operator left, he went over there and actually tasted the fluid that was in the basin to determine how, if he thought it was salty enough to be considered brine water. And he wrote this in his report. And when I read it, I was like, who is this person? Why does he think this is safe and an appropriate way to assess the situation? So that was the kind of inspectors that they were sending out to monitor these well sites.
Yeah. And then Vera Scroggins, did you see her comment, Melissa?
I saw Vera's last one. Yeah. Is that what you're talking about?
Definitely, yeah. We should
Yeah,
probably talk about Ray Kemble's too. He was talking
Yeah,
about how,
I want to get to Ray and Vera too. Yeah.
yeah.
So first we'll do Vera's, and then maybe we'll close up with Ray, because there's an opportunity, I believe, on July 21st. Craig or Ray, please correct us in the chat if I'm wrong about that, but 21st in Susquehanna County with Cabot. There's something coming up. So why don't we use that as a capstone? But Vera says that, and this is absolutely true. Our local people and officials are probably not impressed with the grand jury. It's coming from a Democrat attorney general and Democrat governor. We are deep into Republican Party territory, and I am too here in Potter County. So I'm feeling this hard. My senator is Joe Scarnati. I mean, give me a break. So and she says this to remind us that this is not a partisan issue, but the partisan politics in Pennsylvania are so strong. I mean, the Republican senators have come out in the media talking about how ridiculous this is. And the reality for some of us in especially rural Pennsylvania, where most of the impacts are happening, is that our leaders are completely unwilling to acknowledge the truth. And it's not as simple as passing home rule. And it's not as simple as getting a meeting with them and saying, hey, here's a grand jury report. You should maybe read it. They simply won't do it. And that is a reality that I want to acknowledge. And thank you, Vera, for acknowledging that. So that means that in those places, it is really, really helpful for people in places that have greater protections, like, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, for instance, to organize to come into the rural areas where we don't have the support and the protection of our elected officials, to come in and stand with people like Ray Kemble, who right now is being sued by Cabot Oil and Gas for $5 million. Cabot Oil and Gas contaminated his water supply, and is now suing him for defamation for saying that they did so. Cabot Oil and Gas, for anybody who might not know this yet, Cabot Oil and Gas is facing 9 felony charges and a whole slew of other charges. 9 felony charges that the AG dropped on Cabot Oil and Gas. And Cabot is sticking to their guns. They are not accepting responsibility for this. And Craig, thank you for the comment. Tuesday, July 21st, 2020, there's a rally in Montrose, Pennsylvania, at 10 a.m. for a Clean Water for All rally, because the AG and the AG's attorneys will be facing off with Cabot Oil and Gas's attorneys in the courthouse in Montrose, PA, on July 21st. So if you are able to, please come to Montrose. The rally starts at 10 a.m. and stand with the folks who, like Vera and like Ray, do not have any other recourse in this. Nobody's coming to save them. Nobody's going to change their mind in a decision-making position, and so they need our support to stand with them.
Absolutely. I just wanted to mention too about the partisan issue. I mean, keep in mind, it might have been read by a Democrat. Okay, Josh Shapiro, as a Democrat, may have read what the grand jury said, but the grand jury is not a group of Democrats. Okay, a grand jury is a balanced group of people chosen to come in as the public and determine something. Okay, so whatever somebody's trying to say about this being a political matter, well, guess what? Grand juries are not a political matter. All right, they are all of us, and they're the ones speaking for us. Josh Shapiro is just one talking head returning their information to us, and we thank him for that because he did an excellent job doing it. I mean, his passion really came through, and I want to say that we support Josh Shapiro and what he's doing. I mean, I know we're very critical about this stuff, but we 100% support Shapiro, and we are really hopeful that in the end he will put the handcuffs on the DEP and changes will happen. We hope to see that future soon.
Well, we are 6 minutes past the hour. That's totally okay. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We are going to continue reporting on this. And like I mentioned, on July 21st, if you want to get up close and personal with this investigation and what the AG is up to, Vera Scroggins has sent, there's an update that on July 21st, folks are meeting around 9 or 9:30 at the park right across from the county courthouse in Montrose, Pennsylvania. The court hearing starts at 10, and that is where Cabot and their attorneys will have to answer to the Attorney General's criminal charges.
Nice. Yeah, take your signs. Arrest DEP, arrest Cabot.
Yes.
We're not going to publish that, but that's what we're saying here.
All right, Josh, it's over to you to wrap us up. Take us home.
All right. Well, there's a lot happening at Public Herald. If you guys haven't followed lately, we have a group of really fantastic investigations coming out from a great team. Justin Noble, who did the Rolling Stone story on radioactivity, is part of that. All kinds of really excellent writers from across the country. I mean, we're talking people in Montana, Virginia, Iowa, all looking at Pennsylvania, trying to figure this out. So that'll be coming out between July and August. Stay tuned for that. You can subscribe to us at the bottom of our website, or you can always follow us here at YouTube. We will do another live broadcast as these new investigations come out. So this isn't going to be like a weekly thing, but we will come back and return to this as new information comes. If you want to support Public Herald, we have a new Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Public Herald. Now, this is a chance for us to build a national newsroom of amazing people. We're talking like 24 people we have lined up for this. You can go there and just pledge like $1 a month if you can have it to spare, and that will help us to try and get these folks publicly funded and create an organization that's run by the people and absolutely for the people. And we're really hopeful that we can move in that direction in the future. If you do give just $1, you'll get free access to all of our films. You'll get the tickets to the virtual premiere of Invisible Hand, which is our new documentary, explosive documentary on how you can make change happen with rights of nature in your town or any other means necessary. I mean, Grant Township is a conservative area. This is not a Democratic area. It is an extraordinary film. That is executively produced by Mark Ruffalo, and he will be joining us on September 4th at 8 p.m. Or 7. Was
6.
it 7? 6?
It's 6.
Whatever, 6 p.m. to talk about all this stuff. And we'll have Dago Monondas also there from the Seneca Nation, and Marky Miller from Toledo, who passed Libor. So join us then. You can do that by just signing up on our Patreon, and we really hope to see you there. And Melissa, anything else you want to drop? Go ahead.
Yes, if you are living in the shale fields and you're wondering what to do, who to call,
Who to call?
If you are experiencing, since we're going to keep fracking apparently, if you have issues, I think it's still important to call the Department of Environmental Protection. We want to continue to make these citizen reports public record. Let's keep that keep that roster rolling. But what you really need to do is call the Attorney General's hotline. The Attorney General has set up a hotline, given the fact that DEP is an absolute failure when it comes to regulating the industry and responding to people's reports of harm. So continue calling the DEP to make that part of the public record, to keep showing what they're not doing. Also call the Attorney General's hotline. I do know someone who tested this. It might have been Craig Stevens, actually, who tested it and called the AG's hotline, made a report, and got a call back shortly thereafter. So keep doing that. And I feel like there was something else, but
well, we want to say thank you. Thank you to everybody who came to join us tonight. We will publish this on YouTube, so you can share it from there. Hopefully, we will have a new report out soon. And we really want to thank all of our sources and families and everybody who has helped us tell these stories. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do what we do if they didn't trust us with that information. So we thank them for that. And I want to thank Sierra, Shamer for coming on, who was part of our big report in 2017. Dr. John Stoltz, who helped us with that. Dr. Tony Ingraffia. John Nicholson. Oz Gerard. I mean, there was just like a litany of people. I'm going to miss people. John Smith helped out. You got anybody else, Melissa?
Yeah, special shout out to Craig Stevens, man.
Craig Stevens, yeah.
He really pulled some strings to make that first AG meeting happen, and he rolled in deep with Public Herald and all those impacted people. And Craig, hats off to you. You really you're a huge part of why we're even talking about this tonight.
Yeah, you don't want that guy calling you this. There's a smile on his face.
That's right. All right. Thank you all for joining us again. And until next time.
Stay tuned. Help us overthrow the status quo.
Bye.